The idea that having badly loaned out money, I want to remind you, if you teach a course, as I do from time to time, in an economics department, called Money and Banking, that's what the course is usually called, you give the students weeks of education about the function of a bank. A bank is called, an institution in economics called a financial intermediary. That it is the entity between the depositor who saves money in a bank and the borrower who gets that money out and invests it and spends it. And the job of the bank, we teach our students, is to be a safe repository or depository for people's money, and to be a prudent lender of that money. After all, you're lending out other people's money, and you're supposed to be very cautious. Remember, the banker has to have a three-piece suit, be very conservative, very cautious, in order to perform this crucial social function of moving the money from the saver to the borrower. These banks proved their incapacity to function in the way that economics teaches they must. They didn't prudently do this. They did it imprudently. They lent to people who they shouldn't have lent to. They took chances they should never have taken chances, etc., and they blew it. You could have had, of course, in a different culture, you could have had the government come in and say what I just said. Gentlemen, you blew it. And therefore, there's no room for private banking anymore because you're not a safe place for people to put their deposits. You're not functioning as a successful, effective financial intermediary, and so we're going to try to have a government financial system do that job better. By the way, a decision that has been made in other major capitalist countries. For most of the periods, for example, since the Second World War, the banks in France are public, not private. So the notion that a capitalist government takes over banking to avoid the problems of the private banking sector has a long history in capitalism. But in this country, it doesn't occur. That's not a question so much of conspiracy. They didn't have to conspire. Nobody expected it. Even the Democrats, of course we helped them out. And we're all proud. The New York Times get proud. They have paid back. Isn't it nice? They paid back. What? You just saved them. That they paid back some of the money you gave them. The reason they paid back some is you gave them so much that they could. That's why they paid it back. It's not an achievement. This is a demonstration of what you just did. But there's no demand for them to be nationalized. But it's even worse. One of the beginnings of criticism you can hear, even in the United States, about this as it begins to be understood and people read the documents, is that the Federal Reserve it didn't occur to the Federal Reserve, nor to the United States Treasury, nor to the President, to demand of the banks who got this largesse anything. For example, they weren't told you must, for every billion we give you, you must take at least 50 million and make loans that will create jobs in this way or that. Something. Some little constraint ruled nothing. Nothing. We give you the money, you decide. You remember for a year and a half, we were giving them huge amounts of money, not just in this program, but many other programs. And it was justified on the grounds, whenever anybody even got a justification, that these banks, we were giving the banks the money because then credit would flow, people would have money to borrow and buy things, businesses could expand. And then we were very unhappy because as we watched month after month go by, the unemployment didn't go down. The unemployment stayed around 10%, as it is now. The banks clearly weren't lending the money that they were getting from the government. And when you went to the bankers and you scolded them, which happened over and over again, you're not lending the money. The bankers looked back at the government officials and said, get out of here, you crazy nut. We're not going to lend the money. That's what got us into this mess. Who are we going to lend it to? Companies we can't be sure are solvent? The mass public, which can't even pay back what it already has borrowed? We're not lending to business, and we're not lending to people. We're holding the money. Why? Because that's the prudent thing for us as bankers to do, which was correct. So the government solved the problem by making the banking system whole again. they got through the crisis. That's why they talk about a recovery. They have one. But nobody else has one. Because that's the way this system works. But no, it didn't occur to anyone. You didn't have to have a conspiracy not to socialize them, not to nationalize them, not to give them no rules of what to do with the largesse you gave them. Okay? Now here's the best part. I saved this for last. Follow the bouncing ball as I go through this with you. The Federal Reserve lowers interest rates along with pumping money out. So that the interest rate on the loans that the Federal Reserve charged for many of these tens of hundreds of billions of dollars given to the big banks and a few of these other corporations was in the neighborhood of 0.5%, 0.75%, 1%. Okay, now let's follow. They give billions and billions of, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to lend it to the public? This public? A bankrupt American public? No way. Not going to lend it to them. The only lending that was done to the public over the last 2 years, because I think I told you last time, has been lending for mortgages. And the only reason banks lend for mortgages is that within minutes of the time the mortgage is signed by the borrower, the bank turns around and sells it to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The government buys all the mortgages. Very important you understand that. Why? Because if the government didn't, the private banks wouldn't touch the mortgage market. They wouldn't lend anybody. So the government is keeping that whole thing going. So the banks took a part of the money and they lent it for more, but not much. Because even with the government support, they don't want to be in that business. That's a dangerous business.
And how do they make a profit off of that?
I'm coming to that. So they're not going to lend it to the mass of people because they're not credit worthy, except for some mortgages. They're not going to lend it to business very much because the economy is in too terrible trouble. We have millions of people unemployed. Companies are not doing very well. They're not likely to do very well in terms of growth. If they do well with profit, it's by cutting back their costs. So who are you going to lend to? Same issue in the mind of the banker. Who are we going to lend this to? It's wonderful we get this money and it gives us cash, but we need to make money with it. So what is the major thing that they did with that money? You're going to love this. They lent it to the United States government, which was paying them 2%, 2.5%. Let me do this with you again. The Federal Reserve prints new money, lends it to the banks at 0.5%. The bank says thank you and lends that money to the United States Treasury at 2%.
Wow.
And Obama uses it to stimulate the economy. That's how this was done. That's not a conspiracy. That's how the system works. The government lent them the money and have you with me? And then they lent it back to the government, but 2%. Hundreds of billions of dollars. That's how this was done. And this is done to fix a broken economic and a broken financial system, which in its way, it did. Perhaps it's the most important thing. It did. It fixed the banking system. The revelations of this last week just show you the mechanisms of how this was done. Okay?
Some people said they also used it just to speculate, buy foreign investments and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Do we know how much, what percentage went to treasuries and what?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that kind of work has been done. But it's true that some of the money was lent if you were very confident of certain kinds of trends in the broader economy, you would make some limited amount, but you would make it. For example, as people began to notice that the Chinese economy didn't seem to be having the kinds of problems that we did and Western Europe did, then investment in China began to be attractive as a place to put some of that money. So some of you will feel better about this, that the money that the Federal Reserve lent to the banks was then used to help develop the People's Republic of China. And on behalf of the Chinese, I want to thank you all for your role that you did. So that was done. Once you saw that the Chinese economy was booming, partly with the help of American investment there, with borrowed money, then it became logical also to ask the question, which is what people in stock markets do. If the Chinese are soaring, And the Chinese are a society which, in order to soar, has to bring in a lot of raw material because they don't have it in China. Well, then a smart investment would be to go buy mines in Africa that are producing the things that have to go to China to fuel their growth. That becomes smart. And maybe the companies that ship from one place to another, and maybe the energy producers, because China's a big importer of energy to run its factory explosions. So you begin to have investment. That's why the stock market has had the upturn that it has had, particularly focused on anything having to do with Asian development, directly or indirectly. So yes, you do some means of production, because it's in a very dangerous economy, very fragile. And so if you're a big bank and you have a lot of loans from the Federal Reserve, and you can hold them as a reserve, or you can convince people that are dubious about your status as a bank that you have very good investments. Nothing is better than a U.S. Treasury. That shows everybody, because you can liquidate that and turn it into money anytime. So investing in U.S. Treasuries became enormously profitable and popular for these big banks. By the way, that's crucial, because the United States has been running enormous deficits. You can only run deficits the size of the United States. A deficit is simply, again, for those of you not familiar, when the government spends more money than it takes in taxes. I'm going to come to that in a minute.